The conference room fell silent as Carlos stepped forward, his cleaning uniform still on, and began translating the complex international trade agreement into perfect Mandarin. The executives' jaws dropped. This was the same man they'd watched empty their trash bins just minutes earlier. If you're wondering how a janitor saved a multi-million-dollar deal when 12 professional interpreters couldn't, stick around. This story might change how you see the invisible people in your own life. Hit that like button and subscribe if you believe everyone deserves a second chance, because sometimes the most extraordinary talents hide in the most ordinary places. Carlos Mendez wiped the sweat from his brow as he finished mopping the executive floor of Horizon International. It was nearly midnight, and his shoulders ached from the 12-hour shift. At 42, his body didn't recover like it used to, but he couldn't afford to slow down. Not with Sophia depending on him. The photograph in his wallet was worn at the edges, his daughter's smile beaming back at him, her eyes bright with the intelligence that made him so proud. At 16, she was already dreaming of college, of breaking the cycle of poverty that had defined their family for generations. Carlos would do anything to make that happen, even if it meant working himself to exhaustion. Almost done, Mr. Mendez? The night security guard, Bill, poked his head around the corner. Just finishing up, Carlos replied, his accent barely noticeable after 20 years in America. How's your son doing at baseball? Bill's face lit up. Made the varsity team. Thanks for asking. He hesitated. You know, you speak better English than half the executives around here. Carlos smiled modestly. I've had practice. What Bill didn't know, what nobody at Horizon knew, was that English was just one of 8 languages Carlos spoke fluently. Before life had taken its unexpected turns, he had been a linguistics professor in his home country. Before the political upheaval, before his wife's illness, before he'd fled with nothing but a toddler and the clothes on his back. The next morning, Horizon International buzzed with unusual energy. Carlos noticed the difference immediately as he arrived for his day's shift. Extra security, catering staff rushing through the halls, and a tension in the air that spoke of high stakes. Big day, muttered his supervisor, handing him a list of rooms that needed special attention. Some kind of international merger. The CEO's staking everything on this deal. Carlos nodded and went about his work, invisible as always. The cleaning staff were ghosts in the corporate world, present but unseen, necessary but unacknowledged. He'd learned to use this invisibility to his advantage, listening and learning as he worked. It kept his mind sharp, his languages alive. By mid-afternoon, he was cleaning the hallway outside Conference Room A when the doors burst open. A woman in an impeccable suit stormed out, her face flushed with frustration. Behind her, voices raised in argument. "This is a disaster," she hissed into her phone. The Korean interpreter completely misunderstood their terms, the Mandarin translator seems to be speaking some regional dialect they don't understand, and the Arabic interpreter just called in sick. "We've gone through 12 interpreters, and this deal is falling apart by the minute." Carlos kept his head down, but his ears perked up. He recognized the woman, Catherine Wells, the Director of International Relations. He'd cleaned her office for years, sometimes hearing her practice phrases in various languages, most of them slightly mispronounced. Inside the conference room, the tension was palpable. CEO Richard Harmon stood at the head of the table, his normally confident demeanor cracking under pressure. Around him sat representatives from 6 different countries, their faces showing varying degrees of confusion and annoyance. "Please," Harmon was saying, "if we could just take a short break while we find another translator." A man in an elegant suit replied in rapid Mandarin, his tone clearly indicating he'd had enough delays. Carlos hesitated. He should continue with his work, remain invisible. But something about the desperation in Harmon's eyes, the same look Carlos had seen in his own mirror during his darkest days, made him pause. 20 years ago, he'd made a promise to his dying wife, that he would give Sophia every opportunity, no matter the cost to his pride. He'd buried his credentials, his past, his identity as an educated man to take whatever work would put food on the table in a new country. But perhaps today, just today, he could be more than a ghost. Taking a deep breath, Carlos stepped into the conference room. "Excuse me," he said quietly. All eyes turned to him, some confused, others annoyed at the interruption from a janitor. "Mr. Mendez," Catherine began, "we're in the middle of..." Carlos turned to the Chinese businessman and spoke in flawless Mandarin. "Honorable Mr. Zhang, I believe there has been a misunderstanding regarding the terms of Section 5. Perhaps I could help clarify?" The room fell silent. Mr. Zhang's eyes widened, then he responded rapidly, explaining his concerns. Carlos nodded, then turned to Harmon. "Mr. Zhang is concerned that the profit-sharing agreement doesn't account for seasonal fluctuations in the Asian markets. He suggests a quarterly adjustment rather than an annual one." Harmon stared, mouth slightly open. You speak Mandarin?" "Yes, sir. Also Korean, Japanese, Arabic, Russian, Spanish, Portuguese, and French." Carlos kept his voice humble, his eyes lowered. "I was a professor of linguistics before coming to America." The Korean representative leaned forward, addressing Carlos in her native tongue. A rapid exchange followed, and Carlos turned back to the stunned executives. "Ms. Kim says there's also confusion about the intellectual property clauses. The translation they received doesn't match what you're presenting today." For the next 4 hours, Carlos stood in that conference room, switching effortlessly between languages, clarifying points, smoothing misunderstandings, and occasionally offering cultural context that the professional interpreters had missed. The atmosphere transformed from tense to productive, then to genuinely collaborative. By evening, the deal was signed. 8 signatures on a document that would secure Horizon's future and expand its reach across 3 continents. As the international guests departed, shaking Carlos's hand with genuine respect, Harmon approached him, Catherine at his side. "Mr. Mendez," Harmon said, his voice subdued with something like shame. "I don't know what to say. You've been working here for 7 years, sir. 7 years. Cleaning our offices. And we never knew." Carlos shrugged slightly. "You never asked." Catherine stepped forward. "Why didn't you apply for a position more suited to your skills? We have an entire international division." The question hung in the air, and for a moment, Carlos considered the polite answer. But something about the day's events, about being seen for the first time in years, compelled honesty. "I tried, Ms. Wells. 3 times. My applications were rejected because my degree is from a university your HR department didn't recognize, and because I had a gap in relevant employment." He smiled without bitterness. "It's difficult to maintain relevant employment when you're fleeing a political regime with a child in your arms." Harmon's face flushed. "That's unacceptable. Completely unacceptable. It's reality, sir. For many immigrants. We do what we must for our families." "Your family," Catherine said softly. "You have children?" "A daughter. Sophia. She's 16 now, brilliant with mathematics. She wants to study engineering." Pride crept into his voice. "She works part-time after school to save for college." Harmon exchanged a glance with Catherine. "Mr. Mendez, I'd like you to come to my office tomorrow morning. Not to clean it. We need to talk about your future at Horizon." The next day, Carlos arrived wearing the only suit he owned, purchased years ago for Sophia's school concerts. It was slightly too large now, the years of physical labor and careful budgeting had trimmed his frame. He was offered a position as Director of Multicultural Communications, with a salary that made him dizzy. A salary that meant Sophia wouldn't need to work after school. A salary that meant college applications could be based on dreams, not financial aid packages. That evening, Carlos walked into their small apartment with a contract in his hand. Sophia looked up from her homework, her expression changing as she saw his face. "Dad? What happened?" He told her everything, watching her eyes grow wider, seeing in them the reflection of her mother's pride. "So all those nights you spent listening to language programs while you ironed your uniform," she whispered. "Were worth every minute," he finished. "I made a promise to your mother that you would have every opportunity. That our sacrifices would mean something." Sophia threw her arms around him, and for the first time in years, Carlos felt the weight lift from his shoulders. He was no longer invisible. 3 months later, Carlos stood at a podium, addressing Horizon's global staff about the company's new initiative to identify and develop talent at all levels of the organization. Behind him sat Richard Harmon and the board of directors. Before him, in the front row, sat Sophia, her eyes shining with tears of pride. "Talent doesn't always come with the right credentials," Carlos said into the microphone. "Sometimes it comes with calloused hands and humble jobs. Sometimes it speaks softly from the corners of rooms where decisions are made. But if we listen, if we truly see each person for who they are, not just the role they play, we discover the most valuable resource any company can have: human potential." As he spoke, the cleaning staff entered quietly from the back doors, taking seats reserved especially for them. For the first time, they weren't there to tidy up after the event. They were there as honored guests, as potential yet to be discovered. "Today marks the beginning of Horizon's Pathways program," Carlos continued. "A program that will provide education, training, and advancement opportunities to every employee, regardless of their current position. Because everyone deserves the chance to rise as far as their talents can take them." The applause was thunderous, but Carlos found his daughter's face in the crowd. This was for her. For the promise he'd made. For all the invisible people who kept the world running while their own dreams waited patiently in the shadows. Later that night, as they walked home under a sky full of stars, Sophia slipped her hand into his, just as she had as a little girl. "Dad," she said quietly, "do you think Mom can see what you've accomplished?" Carlos looked up at the night sky, feeling a peace he hadn't known in decades. "I think she always saw who I really was, even when no one else did. And now, others are beginning to see it too." "I've always seen it," Sophia whispered. And in that moment, Carlos knew that all the years of invisibility had been worth it. Because the one person who mattered most had never lost sight of him, even when he was just the man who cleaned the offices after everyone else had gone home. Sometimes the most extraordinary people are hiding in plain sight, waiting for someone to look past the uniform, past the accent, past the job title, and see the human being beneath. Sometimes the person emptying your trash bin is a professor, a poet, a parent with dreams as vast as your own. Sometimes all it takes is one moment of courage to step forward and reveal your true self to a world that has overlooked you for too long. And sometimes, that one moment changes everything.